China and Japan pledged stronger economic ties and regional stability during historic talks in Beijing. Hello, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Being described as a turning point for China-Japan relations. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met with China's leadership on Friday, the first official visit by a Japanese leader to Beijing in 7 years. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang formally welcoming the Japanese Prime Minister with a review of the military guard outside the Great Hall of the People. And during talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the leaders discussed improving relations and greater cooperation on economic trade. Chinese and Japanese companies have signed more than 500 business deals, and the two countries plan to collaborate on dozens of infrastructure projects across Asia. The leaders acknowledging the talks are an important step for both countries.
China and Japan are important neighbors, and peace, friendship, and cooperation are the main directions that both sides should always firmly grasp. Both China and Japan are important countries in Asia. Maintaining regional stability and promoting regional development are the common responsibilities of our two countries.
I believe it carries a great significance that I made this official visit to China in this major milestone year that marks the 40th anniversary of the Japan-China Treaty of Peace and Friendship, and confirmed that these principles serve as a guidepost in Japan-China cooperation for a new era.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution and researches the China-Japan relationship. From Hong Kong, Yoshikazu Kato is an adjunct associate professor with the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. Here with us in the studio is Michael Yahuda. He's a visiting scholar with the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. And Wenran Jiang is a senior fellow with the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. We want to welcome all of you to the show. Let's start in Beijing. Qinduo, the relationship between China has been strained, as you know, over the last few years. What do you make of this strong commitment by both of these countries meeting at this summit?
Well, I would agree with the use of words of a historical turning point. It is historic in the sense of the bilateral relationship, in the sense of the restoration of the relationship of returning to normal after 6 or 7 years in trouble, let's say. And also it is historical in the sense of the global background. Let's say, both nations face the threat from the United States in terms of unilateral approach and also the trade fights, not only with China, but also with Japan. We know Japan was bullied into agreeing to bilateral talks, and China is in the tense fight with the United States.
Yeah, we'll cover a lot of that ground in the next half hour. But Yoshikazu, let me ask you about this. Do you see this as kind of a fresh start for these two countries in a sense?
Yes, I think it's a historic visit to China because, Japan and China have experienced a very difficult time over the last couple of years and decades. So now, we are celebrating the 14th anniversary for Peace and Friendship Treaty, and this is a very momentum. And now, at the same time, some sort of multilateralism and free trade system, and these, very important value and rules are somehow in crisis. So now, as a second, third largest economy in the world, I think now Japan and China should promoting this, the free trade system and the regional collaboration. And this is a very important time for the world and the rest of the world, I think.
And Wenran, when you think about this, the Japanese Prime Minister acknowledging China's economic dominance by announcing that there's going to be an end to its aid. Talk to us about this shift in dynamics, if you will.
Yes,
sorry,
I think,
that addressed to me?
Now
yes.
We are ending.
Wenran? Yes.
Yeah, I would say that the current collaborative approach between the two sides come under the pressure of the United States. It is overdue for two countries to cooperate, but the pressure between Trump's trade war with China, together with the uncertainty between Japan and US relations puts the two countries together. Remember, we've seen these kind of episodes before. This is an international context that put the two countries much closer. There's a global and regional context.
Michael, that's a really good point. A few years back, you came out with a book about China and Japan. It was titled Two Tigers Sharing a Mountain. It's now Two Tigers Sharing a Trump. Both countries having their own difficulties in dealing with the U.S. president. In fact, I was reading a Wall Street Journal a piece where Trump had said he's very unhappy with the very high deficit with Japan. He was quoted as saying, of course, that will end as soon as I tell them how much they have to pay. Sort of this kind of bellicose nature that we've seen with him with China, again with Japan. Is this an effort by both of these countries in terms of coming up with a hedge against the U.S. in a sense?
Well, they're both concerned with their survival and with their future prosperity. And in this sense, they find the American president very unpredictable. He's very insistent, of course, on maintaining balanced trade relationships with all his trading partners and putting America first and so on. But he's also put a lot of emphasis on personal relationships. So whatever the difficulties are with China, he keeps on saying he has a wonderful relationship with the leader of China. And he also says he has a wonderful relationship with the Japanese prime minister. So I think both sides, both Japan and China, recognize that they have to find, if you like, a hedging approach, so as to give them a degree of insurance over their trade policies and over their economic position generally. They are, in many respects, complementary. Japan can supply China with the high technology which it may miss from the United States, and clearly the Chinese market is very important for Japan. So whether this is a really major turning point, I think raises problems, because they have been sort of cooperating and competing now for a number of years, and it will be difficult for them to work together, for example, over the issue of infrastructure in Asia, because they have very different approaches to infrastructure. And it will also mean that the Japanese, who have been busy trying to cultivate Australia, India, and the United States, some kind of quad, they call it, to find a common approach towards China and to resist Chinese pressure. So there are a number of competing elements to this, and I think it's too soon to regard this as a major turning point.
Well, Yoshikazu, that's an interesting point. He's talking about some of the obstacles. Let's talk about Shinzo Abe, because in a way he has to thread the needle, because he wants a closer relationship with China. Obviously, there are needs there, but he also doesn't want to aggravate the U.S. president. I mean, there are allies, Japan and the United States. How does he do this? It's a delicate dance, isn't it?
Exactly, it's a very delicate question. But now, in terms of economic ties, actually in Japanese society, we have very huge demands for strengthened economic ties with China. But at the same time, in terms of security ties, we are allies of the United States. So we need to take balance and manage the trilateral relationship. So in this sense, I think for Shinzo Abe, he can create very good personal relationship with Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi Jinping. So this is very good things based on the personal friendship and trust. But for Japan, in the long term, the problem is how to take balance between the security ties with the United States and economic ties with China. So now Shinzo Abe is trying to lead the regional leadership based on the multilateralism and free trade system. And this is very good approach for Japan's national interest in the region.
Qinduo, he's talking about this personal relationship, but as Michael was pointing out, Donald Trump makes a big deal about his personal relationship with President Xi, and yet the relationship between these two countries obviously very strained by this tariff fight, however you want to describe it. What about the optics of the Xi-Abe meeting here in the you know, in Washington, you know, is this going to change the equation at all, do you think, when Xi and Trump meet at the G20? I mean, given the fact that perhaps China and Japan forging a closer relationship, do you think it's going to have any kind of impact when he meets with President Xi in Argentina?
Well, not necessarily having an impact on President Xi's upcoming meeting with President Trump in Argentina at the end of November, actually. But let me try to clarify a little bit. I know there are doubts about whether this meeting, this trip is historic, whether it will be long-lasting, or it is only a short-term return to stability of this bilateral relationship. From what I observe, I think this is, I do see commitment from both sides, Japanese Prime Minister Abe and the Chinese side. They are committed to a long-term peace and stability because they fully understand that serves their fundamental interests of both nations. In terms of, so it's not hedging alone, it's not a temporary hedging against the threat from the US. It is also about the long-term relationship and also about the competition. Obviously, with this visit, they agreed to sign basically 50 agreements, 50 deals to co-invest in the third-party nations in terms of infrastructure construction along the Belt and Road Initiative. So they are turning competition into cooperation. Both sides agree upon that. And thirdly, people somehow overestimate probably the, the pressure from the US to push the two sides to get closer. But remember, back in 2014, there's an awkward moment of handshaking between Chinese leader and obviously Abe there. But since then, you do see handshaking with the smiles on the faces of both leaders over there. So this has been efforts over the past 6-7 years to bring the two countries together or to normalize the relationship because they see this is in their own interest. For Japan, China is the largest export market, is the largest trading partner. Obviously, without the Chinese market, it is almost impossible for sustained economic growth for Japan. And for China too, especially with the pressure from the US, China needs the technology, needs the experience from the Japanese side. So cooperation served the both sides very, very good, I would say, very well.
Yeah, and Wenran, it's obvious that China wants Japan to buy in on the Belt and Road Initiative, as Shindo was saying, 50 agreements on projects across Asia. Is that enough to satisfy China?
Well, this is a very important development. We all know through the discussion that there are fundamental strategic differences, despite everybody now, Premier Li, President Xi, Prime Minister Abe saying the right things, replacing competition with cooperation. The nature and their competitive elements have not removed. In East China Sea, US, Japan, and other countries strategically lined up very closely. That's being said, several very important signals, as you mentioned. Japan is all but endorsed, not openly, but endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative by signing up on big infrastructure projects. That's number one. This is not something we want to offend the Americans, but nevertheless on board with China. Number two, people have not mentioned large $30 billion worth of currency swap. That is not using US dollars, but using bilateral currency as trade settlement. That's what China wanted very big time. And finally, Japan, China, South Korea will speed up on free trade regional agreement with all the protectionist, nationalist approach that Trump announced. These developments between China and Japan are very important for both countries' strategic interests. So therefore, we look at the trade and economic dynamics. These are very significant. We cannot underestimate these new developments.
Three big takeaways. Michael, as you look at it, as he just outlined it, which one do you think is the most important?
Well, obviously, the other speakers have emphasized the economic side of it, and that's very important. But I think we also have to look at the practical dimensions of it. It's going to be very difficult for Japan and China to work together on infrastructure projects because they come at it in very different ways. Japan insists on it being open and transparent and in accordance with the current international standards. The Chinese approach is much more secretive and involves less regard for whether it fits in with environmental concerns, less regard as to whether countries can pay back the enormous financial debts which come their way. So there are difficulties there to be overcome. Then there has to be some sort of change regard to Chinese behavior with regard to the Jiaoyu Islands or Senkaku Islands. Because right now, Chinese vessels continually infringe on Japan's not only exclusive economic zone, but also in Japanese sovereign waters. That would have to stop. It's interesting that Chinese public opinion has softened on Japan, but Japanese public opinion has not softened on China. So I think we have to expect that this would take some time to bear fruit. At the moment, we are seeing much talk about the big picture, but we need also to pay attention to the practicalities.
Qinduo, let me ask you about that, because the islands obviously have been a sticking point for some time. Do you agree with Michael in regards to that that's going to be an area where these two countries are going to have some difficulty working out their disagreements?
No, I beg to differ here. Look, you know, the latest round of disruption between Japan and China in terms of their bilateral relationship came in 2012, late 2012, after Japan chose to nationalize these Diaoyu Islands, or Yasuku, or you know, in the Japanese names over there. But for the Chinese, China sees that as a unilateral move to change the status quo of this disputed part of territory, because previously both sides agree to put aside the differences and focus on the bilateral relationship. But with that, you know, disruption, let's say, so there's a strong response from the Chinese side, and then we see the next 6, 7 years, the relationship was in trouble. And now there's a fully, I would say, full realization that it's a bit silly, probably. You know, they agree during this meeting to open up hotlines as soon as possible to prevent possible accidental clashes in air or at sea. So obviously they agree to manage possible problems over there. I think there's understanding. Let's somehow both sides agree to put aside again the differences, because it's impossible for them to solve this problem. Let's put aside the disputes. So this is about the territorial issue. And when it comes to the cooperation along the Belt and Road Initiative, you can see, you know, with the recent, you know, a lot of coverage about some of the probably, you know, mismanagement of some of the projects in some countries. There's understanding on the Chinese side. You know, we need to improve the management. We need to improve the quality of the projects and how we operate those, you know, investment and projects in other countries. So for Japan, there's, you know, they stress very much about openness, about the economic feasibility, issues like that. I think for the Chinese side, they have their own strength. That is like easy financing for company investment, so they can cooperate. I think the Chinese side is actually catching up, agreeing with the Japanese standards, let's say. Let's co-invest. Let's do it well, because it serves the interests of not only China, Japan, for example, in the Thailand. There's a Thailand East Economic Corridor. You know, that will be a win-win-win cooperation for 3 countries. I don't see a big problem over there. I do have confidence that they will move smoothly in that respect. When it comes to a security issue, the so-called Quad, you know, Australia, Japan, US, India, look, it's almost collapsing. I mean, India will not take China as the enemy, because India will always be a permanent neighbor of China. And Japan also realized that it's impossible to fight China with its shrinking and aging population. So China will continue to rise, and this is a reality. And the US probably will leave one day. US presence in Asia is reducing. So I think, there's a better understanding of the situation now.
All right, well, we're going to take a short break. Next, we'll continue our conversation on how China and Japan are moving forward as partners. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.